What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
In the documentary about your life, it was stated that you have more credibility because of your history and your background and being such an ardent anti-communist. You know, you had more credibility as a whistleblower than someone like Edward Snowden or Bradley Manning. They didn't have that kind of background. Do you think that if your background was more like theirs, you would have been taken less seriously? Or do you think that background doesn't matter and it really just has to do with the time period in history?
There's more similarity, much more, to me and Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden than there is difference. A big difference is that they're much younger, but in fact, actually, each of them had volunteered for the military. Snowden in particular had volunteered for the special forces, and in the course of training, broke both his legs. They both accepted the role of being what I suspect they would now perceive, as I do, servants of the empire, a U.S. covert empire, essentially, just as I had. And they both became disillusioned with what the U.S. was doing. In the case of Snowden, it was less the issue of warfare, in Chelsea Manning it was, in Iraq and Afghanistan. For Snowden, he saw widespread violation of the Constitution. We had all taken the oath to defend and support the Constitution of the United States, and we each knew that was being violated by the time we made a change. So I identify more with those two people than with any other two people on Earth. And they're much younger, they're different backgrounds, we have different personalities and perspectives that we come to things, but I feel this identity of somebody who's been through the same trajectory that I was, and each of whom stated they were willing to die to stop these violations, to tell the truth. I was very impressed when I read that Chelsea Manning had made that statement, and I thought, well, that's the way I felt following the draft resistors of back in the 60s. The effort to say that there's a big difference between Ellsberg and background, no, in each case, we released documents. So the real issue, the embarrassment, was not our background or their background. I'm saying, by the way, that their background wasn't that different from mine, except that they were younger. They were earlier in the process. But Snowden, for example, had this enormous access to a national security agency, higher than top secret data. And Chelsea Manning did too, as a matter of fact, much more than I'd had at their age. And that helped bring them about to an earlier decision. I very much admired them that they'd come to this position much younger than I had.
Well, most progressives know that Obama prosecuted more whistleblowers and journalists in his 8 years in office than in the previous 100 years, pretty much since the Espionage Act was enacted. The American public doesn't know that. And he was also the least transparent president, even though he campaigned on transparency. His administration answered FOIA requests with either no information or heavily redacted information. They secretly procured the phone records of journalists. They tried to get a New York Times reporter, James Risen, to reveal his sources. So before we talk about what Trump has just done to Assange, do you want to share your thoughts on the Obama administration's treatment of journalists and whistleblowers, just briefly?
Well, the Obama administration spent years trying to find a crime they could charge him with, Julain Assange, that would not be a blatant violation of the First Amendment and would not very obviously apply to the newspapers to whom Julian Assange had given classified information that he got from Chelsea Manning. So, in fact, there is no real difference. The WikiLeaks is a different operation in many ways, obviously, enormous numbers of ways, from the New York Times or the others, but not as in terms of protection of the First Amendment, really. The big argument of whether he's a journalist or not is really just a snare, basically. In terms of his regular operation in trying to reveal truth, they could actual reports and actual data to the world, actually, not just the American people. They're doing the same function as the New York Times at its best, because the New York Times, very specifically, and the Post, has passed on a lot of untrue information that they got from the Bush administration and others, since then, with uncritically. They talk about, I just thought of this actually as we're talking, but they're always talking about Julian Assange passing on stuff without any editing or criticism. His comment is that his only effort is to try to see that the source is verified, rather that the information he's giving is true information, not necessarily that it's true altogether, but that it is a true copy. It hasn't been tampered with. It hasn't been manipulated somehow in some case. The New York Times was extremely uncritical of the false information they were getting from the administration of which I was a part in the Vietnam War for years, and then again in Iraq, totally, and Afghanistan. And to a certain extent, that continues to this day. I'll tell you something that came up just today. It's so like what we've been talking about. There's an article in the New York Times today that Gina Haspel, the former chief of torture at a secret site in Thailand, and the one who was involved in the destruction of evidence of torture in the CIA leader, who is now the head of the CIA, was able to manipulate Trump. This is according to the story. Trump was very unwilling to deport or send off 60 Russian officers, diplomats, officials, visas in this country with respect to the Skripal poisoning in England, which was attributed to Russians. And so the people, his subordinates, wanted him to send off 60, which he was assured, by the way, I've read later, not in the story, would be about the same as Europe sent out. We wouldn't be sending more, but we were about the same. That turned out to be totally untrue, that he was told, and he was angry about it later, having been fooled. Britain, I think, deported some 4 or so, sort of like the missiles. And a few other European countries had deported under 10 each. And he deported 60, which he was not happy about. But she got him to do that by saying that the people involved in the poisoning involved, accidentally, children and ducks. The Skripals, the father and daughter who were poisoned, not legally, it turned out, had been feeding bread to ducks, and that they'd given contaminated bread unknowingly. They'd already been contaminated by a nerve gas type thing to ducks and to children, in order to let them throw food to the ducks, bread to the ducks. And that she showed him pictures of dead ducks and dead or sick, I believe, children. In fact, the implication was they were killed. Well, that was today. I've seen a response to that, which quotes British newspapers at the time, the Mirror and others, at the time, as saying the following: 3 children who had been given bread by Skripal to throw to the ducks had been taken to the hospital, and their blood was checked and found no evidence of poison. No sick children. and no dead ducks. The very idea of, the president, making a decision on the basis of pictures of dead ducks raises questions, at least about her cleverness in influencing the president. The newspaper did not suggest that what they were describing her as having told him might have been false, and was said to be false in British newspapers.
We've given the press, free press, the First Amendment, because they're supposed to speak truth to power and challenge government and authority, and they don't do it at all. They're actually stenographers for the corporate state. They just repeat back exactly what the government tells them. And I feel like with war in Iraq, there was a real change with the first Gulf War, when they embedded the reporters with the troops, because they developed this sympathy or this empathy with the soldiers, and much more so than with the people they were attacking. So I want to get back to Assange and being a whistleblower. So many venerable independent journalists, including Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, and Chris Hedges, have called what Trump is doing a war on the freedom of the press. And you have said that also. But the mainstream media is going along with the narrative that Assange did much more than journalism, that he actually engaged in criminal conspiracy because he tried to help his source crack a password. So can you explain why that is BS?
Obama searched for years, that is his Department of Justice, for a charge that wouldn't seem to implicate the New York Times immediately. This particular charge that he helped, and I'll expand on it in just a moment, but that Assange, or someone that they think was Assange, not named in the chat log, did help Chelsea Manning, or tried to help crack a password, which would look like something that the Times has not done or would not do, and so forth, and would not allow a case against them. Now, that turns out to be misleading in a number of respects, but all of the facts in this case that are alleged or charged were thoroughly aired in the trial of Chelsea Manning years ago, and were known to Obama. And the Obama Department of Justice, of which, as I said, the one that brought more leak prosecutions than all previous presidents put together, did not feel that this charge, which was brought this last week, was sufficient to get a conviction, that they had the facts. The facts were all known. They wanted to prosecute Assange, and they didn't feel this was adequate, despite having brought these other cases. So what Trump, of course, doesn't care about, in a word, doesn't care about the First Amendment. I'm sure he doesn't believe in it. Somebody who says the press is the enemy of the state. I'm sorry.
The enemy of the people.
The enemy of the people. The enemy of the people. Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! Calls her show The Exception to the Rulers. So being an enemy of the state is something that is not even an insult when the state is doing criminal activities, I would say. I wouldn't be, I'm sure I was thought of as an enemy of the state by Nixon, and I would be proud about that. No, the phrase was the enemy of the people.
Right.
And the history of that phrase is that it was used by Stalin against his dissenters and Joseph Goebbels in the Nazis against the Jews and other dissenters. So that's his precedent for saying the press is the enemy of the people, the enemy of the people. It's a extremely ominous turn of phrase, let's say. But he's gone beyond that. Obama himself did have a war on the press, in effect, or at least on the sources of the press, on that part of the journalistic process right at the start. And I was a source, not a journalist. Trump is now going a step beyond that to muzzle the freedom of the press by going after journalists themselves. And although they didn't base this on the idea that Assange is not a journalist, I think we'll hear that in coming months or years, because I think if they do get extradition here, I think it's extremely likely they will wage further charges against Assange, including the Espionage Act, under which I was charged. And we will hear about enemy of the state, or they can't call him a traitor because he's an Australian, but they will say in effect that he's an enemy. And I think that Greenwald and the others are right. Actually, I'm saying the same thing, that in this war against the press, he's now escalated, actually, to direct prosecution, something that was foreseen over the last couple of years, that he would do this, and he finally has done it. And it's not final, because if they extradite him and produce further charges, and if there's a prosecution, I'm sure, really sure, that he will not be the last, that it will open the floodgates for other prosecutions that may very well include the New York Times and the Washington Post and the others, and you and me.
Well, I will tell you, I was already arrested for live streaming. You talk about not editing or not writing. A live streamer is capturing purely the news as it's happening. And I was arrested in the Capitol in Sacramento for live streaming the Poor People's Campaign when they disrupted the Senate proceedings. And I was the first one targeted, and they did that because they wanted to make sure I did not document the arrest of the protesters. And when I told them that I was a journalist, they said, well, do you have a credential? And I don't have a credential in Sacramento because I don't normally report out of there. But I showed him my business card, and he said, you have to, I'm giving you one more warning, you have to leave, and otherwise you will be arrested. So I made a decision on the spot. It wasn't as courageous as what you did, of course. I only spent about 8 hours in jail, but I said, fine, arrest me. I'll live stream my arrest. And then they took us off, and so we got into the CHP headquarters at 2 o'clock. At 6 p.m., they took us into the county jail, and at midnight, they released us. So I guess it was 10 hours. And then they never pressed charges. And I found out that the Sacramento DA has not pressed charges on protesters in the last 20 years. So what it really was designed to try to put a chilling effect on reporting and protesting, is what it was.
Well, that's fascinating, Lauren. I knew none of this, I must say, about you, or that anything like it had happened. And actually, it's not only admirable of you, and let me really thank you for doing what you did. I really do appreciate it and admire it. But it's very interesting that it happened in your case for the following reason. Amy Goodman, of course, was arrested under very comparable circumstances at the convention. And I believe is still contesting that back and forth on that question. Now, no one's going to argue that she's not a journalist. You are in the interesting gray area here that's been raised right along as soon as the issue arose of Assange. Would someone who's a podcaster or a blogger, or uses the digital era now exclusively, do they have the protections of the First Amendment? And I would say, obviously, in terms of what you're doing, there's no question. I will speak in your defense. I'll, you get into this at all. It's a very important case.
I want to make a case. I want to sue them for false arrest, actually. I'm looking for an attorney right now, if you know anyone in California.
If Assange, with this question, whether he's a journalist or not, which that was raised by Bill Keller of the New York Times, who said he's not a journalist in any way that I recognize. He used his information. He very much so. I think Keller was very out of line there, very, very self-serving, in effect saying, don't prosecute me for the kind of thing that Julian did. He's a different breed of animal altogether. And a lot of journalists are taking that position, and it's very short-sighted of them. When they get Assange, they will come after these other guys right after.
Exactly. So now I wanted to ask you, or mention to you, by reading some quotes from your movie, your documentary, about how things have changed. John Mitchell sent a telegram to the New York Times to get them to stop publishing those Pentagon papers. And reflecting on this telegram, James Goodale, the general counsel of the time, said, quote, "What in God's name have we been fighting for in this country for 200 or 300 years to have the right to speak and the right to publish and the right to think against a threat by the government if all we are going to do is give it all up when someone sends a telegram?" And then the Times journalist Hedrick Smith said, the press can make a valid determination of what serves national security, and we can and we will be independent of the government. He then went on to say, "This is a declaration of independence, and it really changed the relationship of government and the media ever since." Now, he said this in terms of reflecting on the Pentagon Papers, but I think that is patently untrue today, based on what I said before about the media being stenographers for the government. They no longer challenge the government. They reprint whatever propaganda they put forward. What do you think has happened to the press over these ensuing decades that have caused this kind of timidity?
One thing that clearly happened was 9/11. A lot of the press has commented on the fact that at that point, they were afraid of being described as enemies of the people, enemies of the nation, enemies of the state. And Dan Rather, who had been in a lot of fights with Richard Nixon, who hated him, and for that matter with Johnson and others, said later what he said at the time, which I thought very questionable. He said, "We have only one president at a time. I salute. If he wants me, what he wants me to do, I say yes, sir," and so forth. That's a paraphrase, but it was something like that. Later, reflecting on that after the disaster of Iraq, which he had not opposed at that point, Rather said, "Being called unpatriotic was like being necklaced with a tire around your neck, that's doused with gasoline and burns you up." This has happened in various police states. And he said he just couldn't afford to risk that. And that's been true pretty much up until now. If it's, I think it's to a degree, to some extent, a little less than it was right after 9/11. But that sort of thing was very true earlier. The Times was just as much of a stenographer about the lies of the Bush administration leading up to Iraq as anybody had been in Vietnam, including the New York Times. The New York Times took uncritically, as did the Washington Post and Newsweek and everybody else, and Time Magazine, the accounts of the Tonkin Gulf incident when I was in the Pentagon, sleeping there overnight. And when I knew that what they were printing about this great gun battle that had gone on was at best based on very questionable, weak reporting, and within days I knew that it had been false. But they didn't even question the possibility of that for years. So that's the traditional attitude of the press. If I can quote my friend Gravel, who departed from this, by reading the Pentagon Papers in to the record when he was a senator. In 2006, when the Congress gave up its efforts to impeach, having promised in some cases that they would impeach Bush for his clearly impeachable crimes that he had done up till then, they didn't do it at all. And in later, I think it was even later than that, when they just showed extreme timidity in challenging a president. And I said to Gravel, "Is this bunch of Democrats unusually cowardly?" And he said, "No, usually cowardly." He said, "The same when I was in."
Yeah.
And that's true. He just barely escaped being censured at the time, possibly even thrown out of the Senate for what he did with respect to the Pentagon Papers. And I know he had discussed with his wife the fact that he might be thrown out, and he said, "Accept that risk." There just aren't many Mike Gravels in the Senate. There never have been. And there aren't that many people with moral courage in the press, although there are some. You mentioned a number of them.
You tried to give the Pentagon Papers to Fulbright and George McGovern even, who I supported in 8th grade. That was the very first political thing I did, was circulate a petition for the McGovern-Hatfield Amendment to end the war. Remember that?
Very good for you. No, that was
That was
good.
good. Here's my theory, and I want to run it by you. I mean, it's not my theory. A lot of people are saying this, that the liberal mainstream media, because now we have to distinguish. We have very partisan media. We have the liberal media and we have the conservative media. Now, the liberal media are not rushing to the defense of Assange because he exposed what the establishment Democrats, many of their allies, did in the media to Bernie Sanders. The conservative mainstream media loved Assange for doing that, but they did not like his exposure of U.S. war crimes. So I understand why neither of them are rushing to his defense right now. But I think that they're being very short-sighted, because it's like that old quote, first they came for the socialists, but I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't do anything. And then they came for the labor unionist and blah, blah, blah. And then they came for me, but there was nobody left to speak for me. I just don't understand why they can't see beyond their politically partisan or their corporate interests to support a principle here. It's very disheartening.
There's nothing new about that. And, you know, people say, how could Trump have said in 2016, I love WikiLeaks, and how could he now be going after the founder of WikiLeaks? And that is not inconsistent. Presidents like leaks that support their campaign, support what they're saying, their party or whatever, and they extremely dislike leaks that are embarrassing to them. And that's consistent. It's not at all true that they are against all leaks.
Yeah.
Most leaks are essentially authorized by the bosses of the people who are the sources. The ones who do it unauthorized by any agency or department or the White House are the whistleblowers who feel they're ready to risk their careers to reveal a wrongdoing. And they're a tiny number of the number of people who actually leak. So the presidents like a lot of leaks and do them themselves all the time. All presidents do. But they dislike it when it embarrasses them, which is usually when the leak is most justified.
Yeah. Now, another difference between then and now is the composition of the Supreme Court. In your case, they overturned the injunction and they said that the press could publish whatever it wants. And Justice Lewis Black said, quote, the press was meant to serve the governed, not the governors. They said that the cry of national security does not justify censorship in advance. Now, can you imagine anyone in our Supreme Court majority saying anything like that today?
When you say anyone, we don't have a Black or a Douglas, actually. It is true that 6-3 voted against the injunction in 1971 of the New York Times and the Post and a number of other newspapers. But having given it to both of them, I then gave it to 17 other newspapers that I thought had opposed the war. And the first of those was the Boston Globe. Yes, there are still papers that are relatively good on that. And yet, as I say, the Times and the Post had both been very bad before that, and were to be bad again on Iraq and on lots of other issues, so forth. So we don't have the moral courage that was exhibited by 5,000 young men, all men in this case, who resisted the draft nonviolently and set the example of going to prison. Perhaps 50,000 were in legal proceedings in that case, and a much larger number made themselves vulnerable to resistance. They don't get the credit that I think they deserve, but in any case, I give them credit all the time because they changed my life. Without them, I wouldn't have thought of doing what I did do. And then we have Mike Gravel, we have a few others like that. Hard to think of one still in the Senate. Senator Feingold, who just lost an election, had been the one senator who did what, who voted against the Patriot Act. And now you have Bernie Sanders, who has actually arrived at the first vote on the basis of the War Powers Act against our totally criminal support of the direct involvement in the war against Yemen war crimes every day, a disaster, a humanitarian disaster. The president just vetoed it.
Yeah.
And remember, Nixon vetoed the War Powers Act, but it was passed over his veto. Now, will they come together to oppose the president's veto in this case? Well, I think we could say the Senate now, this Senate will not. Shocking. It is outrageous, it's scandalous, and it deserves real opposition. We'll see if it gets it. You mentioned, Lauren, earlier Venezuela. The president keeps saying that we have an option. All options are on the table. And one of those options is military units, combat units sent to Venezuela. Now, that is as clear a threat of a war crime and a crime against the peace as I've ever heard. Generally, presidents have concealed their attempt, their plan for an aggressive war, as in Iraq, up till the last minute. They try to make it a fait accompli. Here, they're openly talking about regime change with the support, by the way, of Nancy Pelosi and of other Democrats. Regime change is the definition of empire. It is absolutely forbidden in the UN Charter, which we've ratified as a treaty. It's incredible that this is happening with so little opposition. And I will say this, if we send units, as they're threatening to do, to Venezuela, which, as far as I know, would be the first time in American history that we put ground combat units into Latin America, South America, as opposed to Central America, where we have intervened very often. But I'm not aware of a case where we've actually done that below Central America into South America. And if we intervene that blatantly, there should be as much opposition as there ever was to the Vietnam War, even though there isn't a draft now, and there won't be draftees going down there, but it would justify, I would say, a general strike, as would preparations for attacking Iran would be, which we're seeing right now.
I have been covering this. I've gone to a couple of what they call hands-off Venezuela protests in Los Angeles, and the turnout amongst the public is very low. I would say there's less than 500 people at these rallies in Los Angeles, which is the largest city in California, obviously. Every time you had a press conference, you told the press about how many bombs were dropped that week. And each week it was enough bombs, the same amount of bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima. And you said that the press never reported that. Howard Zinn also said that you felt very strongly that if all this truth came out, that the public would care and that the public would do something. And the public really never did. I mean, I don't know if it's just people having to work 2 and 3 jobs just to stay afloat. The fact that the mainstream media doesn't give people the information they need to make decisions in a democratic society, or the fact that the education system is so dumbed down, people aren't even taught to think critically. They're just taught to spit back answers on standardized tests. I don't know that we have the tools to sustain our democracy anymore. This is what I'm worried about.
Nixon's attitude, I don't care about the civilian casualties. I just don't give a damn. That's what he said. Is shared by, not unique to Richard Nixon. It's very widely shared if those civilian casualties are others, people over there. Certainly if they're another color, that helps if there's a racist aspect to this, but not entirely. The Germans were not other in that sense. We have a very large German population over there. And we killed over 600,000 German civilians without atom bombs in World War II. And been very little criticism or reflection on that ever since. Then we proceeded 900,000 Japanese civilians. Again, those were enemies. And when you define some people as enemies, enemies of the state, enemies of the nation, enemies of the people, you are very close to allowing people to participate in extermination of various kinds. That's what those phrases suggest. I remember Senator Goodell saying to me, he said, Dan, the American people don't care about Vietnamese casualties. And I remember saying to him, you might be right, but I hope you're not, because I think Nixon is going to be able to reduce the number of American troops on the ground and American casualties and make this an air war in which it's nearly entirely Vietnamese who get killed. And if you were right that they don't care at all, I don't see how we'll get this war over. And in retrospect, now that I'm at Goodell's age then and much beyond it, there was a lot of truth in what he said. It doesn't apply to everybody. All humans are all Americans. But it does characterize an awful lot of humans. And that is that when you dichotomize people to us and them, which all humans do all the time, there's a we group and a they group, an us and a them. And I'm afraid that humans, when they define the other people as them, a lot of them, there's of course concentric circles here and overlapping circles and we groups that get bigger and bigger, but they never encompass the whole globe. You always get to an awful lot of people out there that humans just don't care about at all. And so their leaders, whether they're democratic leaders or authoritarian or tyrants or whatever, socialists, capitalists, when they get defined as enemies, and even as not enemies, but just others, not like us, the ability of those leaders, if it seems to serve their purposes, to let a lot of them die from starvation or other reasons, or climate, which is facing us in the future, or war, they don't get the opposition to it that I think would be necessary. And that human characteristic, I think, makes our situation right now in the age of climate change and nuclear buildup, doomsday machines on both sides. That means that the likelihood that we will survive these capabilities is very low. It's just not zero. It's not impossible that people will rise to the necessities that are facing us to save our civilization altogether, not just America, and to save our species, and to save other species. A nuclear winter, for example, would kill 98% or more, 99%, probably not all, of humans. If a nuclear war between the US and Russia occurred, perhaps 1 or 2% of humans would survive more than a year. Both the US and Russia are preparing the capability for omnicide, which they've had now for more than half a century. And they're preparing to modernize it, to sustain it. That's happening both sides, and it involves enormous numbers of people who are maintaining those doomsday machines on both sides. The threats, supposedly for deterrence, they're persuaded that it's necessary, but it doesn't take a lot to persuade them. That's the human problem. They are subject to that manipulability very easily. You have been working, it seems, since very young in your life, and a lot of others have been spending their lives on this, but it is a minority that can save us. But it's not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed. It's not even, frankly, very likely. But the odds are such that it is worth risking lives, your own lives, risking your careers to make that chance of preserving our species and our civilization and the other species less unlikely, from unlikely to less unlikely, to try to prolong this human existence.
Well, Chris Hedges says that it only takes 2 to 3% of the population to do this. And he calls for mass nonviolent civil disobedience. And I feel that personally working through the electoral process and the legislative process is all well and good, but with being 2 minutes to midnight on the doomsday clock as far as nuclear war and only having 12 years to stop catastrophic climate change, I think we have to do things that are much more drastic than these kind of reformist electoral legislative things.
You don't change the legislature. You're not going to get the change in policy. and the executive in the legislature. But will you get the legislature, and will they do it without massive, active, nonviolent resistance and truth-telling? No, I don't think so. I think you have to have both. The need for showing and demonstrating moral courage to your fellow citizens and your fellow voters is, I think, essential.
Well, I don't want to give you the impression that I don't do that. I head up the legislative action team of the California Progressive Alliance. So I'm very keyed into legislation because I actually do believe that we can affect more change on the local and state level than we can on the federal level. So that's what I work on as far as that goes. But final question to the young activists who are watching and are being very inspired by you tonight, who are very worried about either these two existential threats of nuclear war and climate change. What is your advice to them?
No one can do everything or all the things that are needed. You have to look at your own situation. I do have no doubt that almost everyone at various times in their life faces a choice between telling the truth at the risk of their relationships with their boss, with their agency, with their team, and often even with their families, risks to their families of the retaliation that what we say waged against them. They face that choice between doing that or going along, to go along and get along. And really, to have a job at all, let alone to be a legislator or official, there has to be a lot of going along, getting along with it, even when you don't agree or you strongly disagree. And yet, in virtually everyone's life, there are times when you say, I shouldn't go along with this, even if I have to pay a very high price to oppose it. And many people have set the example of doing that. Everyone should consider it, I would say, at those times in their life. Should I be silent about what I know to be wrong, or should I come out and tell the truth? There has to be a lot more of the latter, risk-taking, than we have seen in our country as a whole in my lifetime, or ever really, probably any country's lifetime. By the way, I don't know of any country that had as much nonviolent resistance to a war going on as the U.S. in the Vietnam War. We don't recognize that as part of our heritage or our best quality. It wasn't enough by itself to end the war from one year to the next. It went on years after the first demonstrations and the first draft resistance, but it was essential. That will be true of climate as well, and certainly of the nuclear era. By the way, I had the privilege of meeting Greta Thunberg in Sweden, one of my new great heroes at 16. And when she was 15, she started a strike from school on Friday mornings. She took off Friday mornings and sat in front of the parliament telling the Swedish government with a sign, and her message was, you are so proud of yourselves for doing more on renewable energy than almost anybody else, but it's not enough. Your emissions, our emissions in Sweden of fossil fuels are going up, nevertheless, not down. She's very uncompromising on this point. You're not doing enough by any means, even Sweden. She was joined by a handful of others. And by the time Patricia and I happened to be in Sweden a couple of months ago, even then, there was about maybe 70 people on a very snowy, very cold morning in front of Parliament when I was able to meet her and join her in doing that. On March 15th, over 1 million teenagers struck on a Friday morning around the world in 120 countries on a school strike calling for addressing their elders to address climate change. Will that do the job? Probably not, as I'm saying. Probably not. It certainly hasn't done anything yet. But the difference between months earlier, when one young woman was doing that, and March 15th, with 1 million people around the world doing it and getting a lot of coverage and getting them much out, shows she's so adamant in saying, I'm not after just getting a lot of people in the streets. I'm after change. I want to see the change, and we haven't seen it. She doesn't compromise on that point. We're going to need that on a lot of subjects. And so what you're saying, what can I say to the young activists? You can be Greta Thunberg.
Yeah. And we have a lot of them in this country. We have the Sunrise Movement that sat outside of Nancy Pelosi's office and are inspiring AOC with the Green New Deal.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually joined the people who were sitting in the offices there, and to join them, something that congressmen very rarely do. I once met Senator Wellstone, who had just been elected, on a picket line we were marching in a picket line in front of the White House against the Gulf War, as I believe it was at that point. Very rarely, do legislators do that, but it's needed. It's called for right now. And Bernie Sanders is pushing that kind of initiative right now in Congress in a way that we haven't seen before.
I want to thank you very much for joining my show tonight. It's truly an honor and a privilege to talk to the most dangerous man in America. And I encourage everybody to watch that documentary, because not only does it talk about Daniel's life and his work, but it is so riveting. It's just interesting. It's not one of those typical talking heads kind of documentaries. The hour and a half goes by very quickly, and you can rent it on Vimeo for $4.99. It's not on YouTube. You actually have to pay, and I believe in paying. I don't pirate music because I think the creators need to get paid for their work. So I encourage you to watch it. And if you haven't seen my show before, I know I have a lot of viewers because of my illustrious guest. You can also follow me on Twitter at Lauren_Steiner. So thank you very much, Daniel, for joining me tonight. And thank you for being the hero that you are.
And thank you, Lauren. And I'd like to hear more about it in the future, for being in the vanguard of podcasters, bloggers who have risked and earned arrest for protest. We need a lot more of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.